In my 34 years as sheriff of Brewster County, Texas, I've seen things that would make most folks question their sanity. Bodies mummified by the desert heat, cartel violence that would turn your stomach, and enough human desperation at the border to break your heart 1,000 times over. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what Border Patrol agent Maria Santos reported on August 15, 2021. If you're watching this from Texas, you know Big Bend. You know how empty it is out there. 3,200 square miles of nothing but desert, mountains, and the Rio Grande marking the line between us and Mexico. It's a place where people have been crossing borders for thousands of years. Apache, Comanche, Spanish conquistadors, Mexican revolutionaries, modern migrants. They've all passed through that desert. Some made it, many didn't. But what Maria found that night wasn't about people crossing from Mexico to America. It was about people crossing from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that shouldn't exist. Somewhere that, according to every map ever made, doesn't exist. My name is Sheriff Roy Brennan, and this is the story of how I discovered that some borders aren't between countries. They're between times. And sometimes, those borders get crossed. Drop a comment if you're from the Big Bend area. Have you ever seen something out there in the desert that didn't belong? Something that made you question which century you were in? Because after what I saw, I know I'm not the only one. August in Big Bend is like standing in front of an open oven that stretches to every horizon. The temperature hits 115 degrees by noon, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and dance, creating mirages that can drive you half crazy if you stare at them too long. I was in my office in Marathon, the county seat, trying to make sense of the monthly budget reports when the call came in from the Border Patrol station in Sanderson. Sheriff Brennan, this is Agent Carlos Mendez. We've got a situation that... Well, sir, we need you to come down here. Agent Santos has reported something that needs your attention. There was something in his voice, not quite fear, but a kind of confused concern that made me pay attention. Border Patrol agents in this region see everything from drug mules to human trafficking to dead bodies in the desert. They don't call unless it's serious. What kind of situation, Carlos? Sir, I think you need to hear it from Santos directly. She's pretty shaken up, and to be honest, we're not sure how to file this report. The drive from Marathon to the Border Patrol station took an hour through some of the most desolate country in America. Nothing but creosote bushes, ocotillo, and the occasional roadrunner darting across the blacktop. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and brown layers of ancient rock that had been watching over this desert since before humans existed. Agent Maria Santos was waiting in the station's conference room. I'd known Maria for 5 years. She was one of the best agents in the sector, tough as leather, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had an instinct for trouble that had saved lives more than once. But sitting there under the fluorescent lights, she looked rattled in a way I'd never seen before. "Sheriff," she said, standing as I entered. Her uniform was dusty, and there were scratches on her arms like she'd been through heavy brush. "Maria, Carlos says you've got something I need to hear." She glanced at Carlos, then at the station chief, Tom Rodriguez, who'd joined us. "They think I'm crazy, Sheriff. Maybe I am, but I know what I saw." "Just tell me what happened," I said, settling into a chair across from her. Maria took a breath, organizing her thoughts. "I was on patrol last night, working the sector between Santa Elena Canyon and Mariscal Mountain. You know that stretch? It's rough terrain, not a popular crossing spot because of the canyons and the lack of water. But we've had sensor hits there lately, so I was checking it out. I knew the area. It was some of the most remote land in the entire United States, the kind of place where you could walk for days without seeing another human being. About 2 a.m., I saw lights," Maria continued. "Not flashlights or vehicle lights. These were different. Oil lamps, maybe, or torches, moving in a line along what looked like a trail. I counted maybe 15, 20 people." Migrants? I asked. That's what I thought. I called it in and moved to intercept. But Sheriff... She paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. As I got closer, I could see they weren't modern people. Their clothes, the way they moved, everything about them was wrong. Wrong how? They were dressed like soldiers from another era. Some had uniforms that looked Mexican, but old. I'm talking 1840s, 1850s old. Others looked like American cavalry from the same period. They were armed with muskets and sabers, and they were escorting civilians, women in long dresses, children in period clothing, a priest in traditional robes. Carlos shifted uncomfortably. Maria, you sure the heat didn't... I know how it sounds, Maria snapped. But I followed them for 2 miles. I got close enough to hear them talking. Some were speaking Spanish, but old Spanish, formal. Others were speaking English with accents I've never heard. And they were talking about getting to the crossing before dawn. What crossing? I asked. That's the thing, Sheriff. They were heading for Boquillas Canyon, but not the modern crossing. They were following a trail that doesn't exist on any of our maps. I tried to call it in, but my radio was dead. My GPS couldn't get a signal. Even my compass was spinning. She pulled out her phone and showed me a video she'd tried to take. It was mostly static and darkness, but for a few seconds you could make out figures in the distance, illuminated by flickering lights. The quality was terrible, but there was something unsettling about how they moved. Too formal, too organized, like a military formation from another century. I followed them to a spot about 3 miles up Boquillas Canyon, Maria continued. There's nothing there officially. No trail, no crossing, nothing. But these people, they walked right up to a section of canyon wall and... Sheriff, I swear to God they walked through it. Not around it, not over it. Through it, like it wasn't there. Tom Rodriguez, the station chief, cleared his throat. Maria's a good agent, Sheriff, one of our best. But this story... I went back at dawn, Maria interrupted, to the exact spot. There's nothing there but solid rock. I checked the ground for tracks, nothing. No sign anyone had been there, but I found this. She placed something on the table. It was a button, brass, tarnished with age. It had an eagle design on it that looked military, but the style was definitely not modern. I had a friend at the university look at it, Maria said. It's from a Mexican military uniform, circa 1846. The Mexican-American War. The room was silent for a moment. I picked up the button, feeling its weight, its reality. It was genuine. I could tell that much. Show me, I said. Maria looked relieved. You believe me? I believe you saw something. Let's go figure out what it was. We took my truck and Maria's Border Patrol vehicle, driving south from Sanderson toward Big Bend National Park. The road deteriorated from paved to gravel to barely more than a dirt track. By the time we reached the area Maria had described, it was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the desert. The spot was unremarkable, a section of Boquillas Canyon where the walls rose about 60 feet on either side. The Rio Grande ran shallow here, maybe knee-deep, easy enough to wade across. But there was no sign of any trail, no indication that groups of people had been passing through. It was right here, Maria said, pointing to a section of canyon wall. They walked straight through like there was a doorway. I examined the rock face. It was solid limestone, worn smooth by centuries of wind and occasional flood. But as I ran my hand along it, I felt something odd, a variation in temperature. Part of the rock was cooler than it should be, given the afternoon sun. Maria, what time did you say this happened? Between 2 and 3 a.m. I made a mental note. Let's wait, see if anything happens tonight. We set up an informal surveillance post about 100 yards from the spot, hidden behind some larger rocks. As the sun set and darkness fell over the desert, the familiar sounds of the night began. Coyotes in the distance, the rustle of nocturnal animals, the whisper of wind through the canyon. At 2:17 a.m., everything changed. The air became thick, almost electric. My radio started producing static and my phone lost signal. Then we saw them, lights in the distance, moving along a trail that hadn't been there moments before. A clear path now wound through the desert, and along it came exactly what Maria had described. It was a convoy from the past. Mexican soldiers in uniforms from the 1840s, American cavalry, civilians in period dress. They moved with purpose, some on horseback, most on foot. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Men carried possessions in bundles. It was clearly a group of refugees fleeing something, seeking safety across the border. But this wasn't a reenactment. These people were real, solid, present. I could hear their voices, smell the horses, see the dust their feet kicked up. Yet my mind rebelled against what I was seeing. This was impossible. "Sheriff," Maria whispered, "look at the canyon wall." Where solid rock had been, there was now an opening, not a cave, but a passage that seemed to lead through the canyon to the other side. It shimmered slightly at the edges, like heat distortion, but it was definitely there. The convoy approached the passage. The lead soldier, a Mexican officer with elaborate epaulets, raised his hand to halt the group. He turned and seemed to look directly at us, though we were hidden in darkness 100 yards away. "Los vigilantes," he said clearly. "The watchers. They see us again." A chill ran down my spine. He was talking about us. The American cavalry officer rode up beside him. "Every crossing someone sees," he said in accented English. "It matters not. The doorway opens when it will. We cross when we must." "But they remember," the Mexican officer replied. "Each time, more remember. Soon, too many will know." "Let them know," the American said. "Who would believe? A doorway between times. Refugees from a war that ended before their great-grandfathers were born. We are ghosts to them, nothing more." They continued through the passage, the entire convoy taking nearly an hour to pass. We watched in stunned silence as soldiers and civilians from 1847 walked through our 2021 desert, crossing a border that existed in both times simultaneously. As the last figure, an elderly priest bringing up the rear, entered the passage, he paused and looked back at us. He made the sign of the cross in our direction, then spoke in Latin. I caught only fragments, but one phrase stood clear. Tempus non lineare est. Time is not linear. The passage remained open for several minutes after they'd all gone through. I could see through it to the other side. Not the Mexican side of the Rio Grande as it existed now, but as it must have existed then. A small settlement was visible, torches burning, people in period dress waiting to receive the refugees. Then, like a door closing, the passage vanished. The canyon wall was solid rock again. The trail the convoy had followed disappeared, leaving only the usual desert scrub. The only evidence of what we'd witnessed was the disturbed dust in the air and our own traumatized minds. "Jesus Christ," Maria breathed. "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. How do you explain seeing refugees from the Mexican-American War crossing the border in 2021? How do you report that the border has a hole in it? Not between countries, but between centuries? "We need to research this," I said finally. "Find out if there are other reports, other sightings. Because if this has been happening—" "Sheriff," Maria interrupted, pointing to the ground where the convoy had passed. "Look!" In the dust were fresh tracks, horse hooves, wagon wheels, footprints from boots that hadn't been made in over a century. But even as we watched, they were fading, being erased by a wind that had suddenly picked up. Within minutes, there was no physical evidence that anything had happened, except for the button in my pocket and the matching one Maria now pointed to on the ground. Another brass button from a Mexican military uniform, 175 years old but looking like it had been dropped moments ago. We gathered what evidence we could and headed back to the station. Neither of us spoke during the drive. What was there to say? We'd just witnessed something that challenged everything we thought we knew about reality, about time, about the nature of the border itself. Back at the station, I made coffee while Maria pulled up historical records on her computer. It was 5 a.m., that gray hour before dawn when the world feels thin and anything seems possible. "Sheriff," Maria said, her voice tight, "you need to see this." She'd found reports, dozens of them, stretching back decades. Border Patrol agents reporting strange lights and figures in period dress. Rangers in Big Bend National Park documenting temporal anomalies. Local ranchers telling stories of seeing cavalry patrols from another century. All from the same general area, all dismissed as heat mirages, hallucinations, or tall tales. But the most interesting report was from 1953. A detailed account by a Texas Ranger named William Boyd, who claimed to have not just seen the crossing, but to have spoken with one of the travelers. According to Boyd, the man claimed to be a survivor of the Goliad massacre of 1836, fleeing to Mexico after the Texas Revolution. He said there were thin places along the border where different times touched, where those fleeing war and persecution could sometimes find passage not just across space, but across time. "My God," I said, reading Boyd's report. "This has been happening for decades, maybe centuries. The question is," Maria said, "what do we do about it?" The next morning, I sat in my office, staring at the evidence we'd collected. 2 military buttons from the 1840s, Maria's corrupted video footage, and a pile of historical reports that nobody had ever connected before. My deputy, Jake Martinez, knocked and entered with a fresh cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "Sheriff, you look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," I admitted. "Jake, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to keep it quiet." Jake had been with the department for 12 years. He was solid, reliable, and most importantly, discreet. "What do you need?" "Research every missing person case in Brewster County for the last 50 years. But specifically look for anything unusual about the circumstances. People who disappeared near Boquillas Canyon, witnesses reporting strange lights or people in old-fashioned clothing, anything that doesn't fit the normal pattern." "This about that Border Patrol agent's report? You heard about that?" "Sheriff, in a county this size, everyone hears everything. Santos is saying she saw ghosts from the Mexican-American War. Half the Border Patrol thinks she's lost it. The other half..." He paused. "The other half have their own stories." That caught my attention. "What kind of stories?" "My cousin Raul works Border Patrol out of Del Rio. Says they've got a whole unofficial file of weird shit, excuse my language, that agents have reported over the years. Stuff that doesn't make it into official reports because nobody wants to be the guy who filed paperwork about time travelers or ghost soldiers." "Can you get me that file?" Jake grinned. "Already working on it. Raul owes me a favor." While Jake worked his sources, I decided to visit someone who might have more answers. Dr. Elena Vasquez at Sul Ross State University in Alpine. Elena was a professor of borderlands history and had written extensively about the Mexican-American War and its aftermath. If anyone would know about historical anomalies in the region, it would be her. The drive to Alpine took me through some of the most beautiful country in Texas. High desert gradually giving way to the mountains, the landscape painted in shades of brown and gold under the vast blue sky. Elena's office was in the history department, a small room crammed with books, maps, and artifacts from 2 centuries of border history. "Roy Brennan," she said, standing to shake my hand. "I heard you might be coming. Maria Santos called. Said you'd witnessed something unusual." Elena was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a bun and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had the air of someone who'd spent their life pursuing truth through dusty archives and forgotten documents. "What did Maria tell you?" "Enough to know you've encountered something I've been researching for 30 years, Elena said, gesturing for me to sit. "Tell me exactly what you saw." I described the convoy, the passage through the canyon wall, the conversation between the officers. Elena listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as if I was confirming something she already suspected. When I finished, she stood and pulled a large map from a filing cabinet. It was hand-drawn, obviously old, showing the Rio Grande region, but with markings I didn't recognize. This map was made in 1851 by a Mexican priest named Father José María Rodríguez, Elena explained. He traveled extensively along the border, ministering to communities on both sides. But he also documented something else, what he called Los Pasos del Tiempo, the passages of time. She pointed to several marks along the river. One was exactly where Maria and I had been the night before. According to Father Rodriguez, there are 7 places along the border where time folds, where past and present can coexist. He believed these passages opened during times of great suffering or desperation, allowing refugees from one era to escape into another. "That's impossible," I said, even though I'd seen it with my own eyes. "Is it?" Elena asked. "Roy, the border has always been more than just a line between nations. It's been a boundary between worlds, Spanish and indigenous, Mexican and American, rich and poor, past and future. Maybe, sometimes, those boundaries become permeable." She showed me more documents. Military reports from the Mexican-American War describing soldiers who vanished without a trace. Native American oral histories about warriors who walked into the mountains and emerged in a different age. Spanish colonial records of expeditions that found evidence of future events. "But here's what really interests me," Elena said, pulling out a modern folder. "The crossings are becoming more frequent." The folder contained her own research, tracking reported sightings and anomalies. The pattern was clear. What had been once a decade events in the early 1900s were now happening monthly. "Why?" I asked. "I have a theory," Elena said. "Every major conflict along the border creates, let's call them temporal refugees. People displaced not just from their homes, but from their time. The Mexican-American War, the Apache Wars, the Revolution of 1910, the Border War. Each one generates groups of people desperate enough to take any escape route, even one that leads through time. But they're crossing now, into our time. Or we're seeing them cross in their time, or both times are happening simultaneously." She smiled at my confused expression. "Linear time might be an illusion, Sheriff. What if all times exist at once, and these passages are places where we can perceive that truth?" My phone rang before I could respond. It was Jake. "Sheriff, you need to get back here. We've got a situation." The situation was a missing person report, but not a typical one. James Patterson, a history professor from the University of Texas, had been camping in Big Bend with his graduate students. He'd gone for an evening hike near Boquillas Canyon and hadn't returned. His students reported seeing strange lights in the direction he'd gone. I met Maria at the park entrance. She looked tired but determined. "It's happening again," she said. "Different spot, about 2 miles from where we were last night." We gathered a search team, myself, Maria, 2 park rangers, and Jake. As we headed into the desert, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and orange. By the time we reached the area where Patterson had disappeared, it was full dark. We spread out, calling Patterson's name, our flashlights creating pools of light in the darkness. Then, at exactly 9:17 p.m., the air changed. That same electric feeling, the same failure of electronic devices. "Sheriff?" One of the rangers, a young woman named Amy Chen, called out. "Over here." We converged on her location. She was standing at the entrance to a narrow canyon, her flashlight illuminating something extraordinary. There were 2 sets of footprints in the sand, one modern hiking boots, clearly recent. The other was older style, what looked like cavalry boots with spurs, and they seemed to be walking alongside the modern prints. We followed the tracks into the canyon. About 100 yards in, we found Patterson. He was sitting on a rock, calmly talking to someone. That someone was wearing the uniform of a U.S. cavalry officer circa 1870. "Professor Patterson?" I called out. Both men turned to look at us. Patterson seemed unsurprised by our presence. "Ah, Sheriff Brennan, I was hoping you'd come. This is Lieutenant Colonel William Shafter. He's been explaining the most fascinating things about the Red River War." Lieutenant Colonel Shafter stood and saluted. He was solid, real, not a ghost or hallucination. I could see the dust on his uniform, the sweat on his brow, the weariness in his eyes of a man who'd been campaigning in hostile territory. "Sheriff," Shafter said in a gravelly voice, "the professor tells me it's the year 2021 in your reckoning. Remarkable. In my time, it's 1875, and we're pursuing Comanche raiders who've been hitting settlements along the border." "How are you here?" I managed to ask. "The passages," Shafter replied simply. "They've always existed. The native peoples knew about them, used them to avoid our patrols. We learned to use them too, though command never believed our reports. Thought it was desert madness." "You've done this before? Crossed through time?" "Several times. Sometimes forward, sometimes back. I've seen this desert in many eras, Sheriff. I've watched the river change course, seen settlements rise and fall, observed the endless cycle of conflict and migration along this border." "Why?" Maria asked. "Why keep crossing?" Shafter's expression grew sad. "Because I'm looking for my men. 12 soldiers under my command entered one of these passages in 1875, chasing raiders. They never came out. I've been searching different times, hoping to find them. Have you found any?" 3. One had settled in the 1920s, married a Mexican woman, had children. He was an old man when I found him, didn't want to return. Another I found in 1968, but he'd gone mad from the displacement, couldn't handle existing in the wrong time. The third, he paused. The third had become something else, changed by repeated passages through time, not quite human anymore. Professor Patterson had been frantically taking notes during this exchange. This confirms my theories about temporal mechanics and historical paradoxes. The passages aren't just doorways. They're wounds in time, places where causality breaks down. "Professor," I said firmly, "we need to get you back to your students. But this is the discovery of a lifetime, actual interaction with historical figures, proof that time isn't linear." "It's also dangerous," Shafter interrupted. "The passages take a toll. Each crossing leaves you less anchored in your own time. Cross too many times, and you might not be able to return. Or worse, you might return changed." As if to emphasize his point, we heard voices approaching. A patrol of soldiers emerged from the darkness, but these weren't from Shafter's era. They wore Confederate gray, and they looked lost, confused. "Colonel," one of them said to Shafter, "we've been marching for days. The stars are wrong, the landscape is wrong. What happened to the war?" "Which war?" Shafter asked gently. "The war, sir. The war between the states. We were retreating from Glorieta Pass, trying to reach Texas, but we entered a canyon and everything changed." These were Confederate soldiers from 1862, displaced in time by nearly 160 years. They'd been wandering in temporal limbo, aging slowly or not at all, searching for a way home that no longer existed. "This is getting out of hand," I said. "We've got temporal refugees from multiple eras converging on the same point. Why here? Why now?" Shafter looked grim. "The passages are widening. What were once small tears are becoming gaping wounds. More people are crossing, intentionally or accidentally. And some things that were never meant to exist in the same time are beginning to meet." Before I could ask what he meant, we heard it, a sound that didn't belong to any era. It was mechanical, yet organic, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the canyon walls themselves. "We need to leave," Shafter said urgently. "Now." "What is that?" "Something that feeds on temporal displacement. It's drawn to paradoxes, to people who exist outside their proper time. The more temporal refugees gather in one place, the stronger it becomes." We started moving back toward the canyon entrance, but the Confederate soldiers were panicking, some running deeper into the canyon, others freezing in place. The pulsing sound grew louder, and the air began to shimmer with that same heat distortion effect I'd seen at the passage. "Don't look at it directly," Shafter warned. "It exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Human minds can't process it properly." But it was too late. In my peripheral vision, I caught a glimpse of something emerging from the canyon wall. It wasn't solid or gaseous, but something in between, constantly shifting between states. It had what might have been tentacles or arms or roots, reaching out toward the displaced soldiers. One of the Confederates screamed as the thing touched him. His body began to flicker, aging rapidly, then reverting to youth, cycling through different stages of existence. Within seconds, he had become unstuck in time, existing in all moments of his life simultaneously before disappearing entirely. "Run!" I shouted. We fled the canyon, hauling Professor Patterson with us despite his protests about observing the phenomenon. Behind us, the Confederate soldiers were being consumed one by the temporal predator, their screams echoing across centuries. Shafter stopped at the canyon mouth, drawing his cavalry saber. "I'll hold it here. Get your people to safety." "You can't fight that thing with a sword." "No, but I can offer it a more interesting target. I've crossed through time so many times, I'm practically a temporal anomaly myself. It'll focus on me, give you time to escape." Before I could protest, he charged back into the canyon, shouting a battle cry from a war that ended 150 years ago. The pulsing sound shifted, following him, drawn to his temporal displacement. We ran. We ran through the desert night, not stopping until we reached our vehicles. Behind us, the canyon was lit with an impossible light, flashes of different time periods strobing like a broken film reel. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, Professor Patterson was in shock, muttering about impossibilities and paradoxes. Maria was silent, staring back at the canyon. Jake and the Rangers looked like they'd seen hell itself. "What do we do?" Jake asked. "How do we report this?" I didn't have an answer. How do you file a report about Civil War soldiers being eaten by a temporal predator while a cavalry officer from 1875 fights it with a saber? How do you explain that the border has holes in it that lead not to Mexico but to the past? "We don't," I said finally. "Not officially, but we need to warn people. Set up a perimeter around these passages. Keep people away." "Sheriff," Maria said quietly, "look." In the distance, we could see lights. Not modern lights. Torches, lanterns, campfires. They stretched along the border as far as we could see. Thousands of them, from dozens of different eras, all converging on the passages. "They're all coming," Maria whispered. "All the refugees from all the borders' wars. They're all trying to cross at once." By dawn, we had established a command post at the Border Patrol station in Sanderson. The parking lot was full of vehicles, Border Patrol, Park Service, my deputies, and 3 black SUVs with federal plates that had arrived without explanation. Inside, the conference room had been transformed into a crisis center with maps, laptops, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. Tom Rodriguez, the Border Patrol station chief, was on his 3rd cup when he pulled me aside. "Roy, we've got a problem. A big one. Bigger than temporal passages and predators from outside time? My agents are reporting crossings all along a 50-mile stretch. Not just from the past. We've got people claiming to be from the future trying to cross into Mexico. Said they're fleeing something called the Water Wars of 2089. Before I could process that, one of the federal agents approached us. She was in her 40s, professional, with the kind of calm that suggested she'd seen strange things before. "Sheriff Brennan, I'm Special Agent Diana Foster, Department of Homeland Security, Anomalous Events Division." "There's an Anomalous Events Division?" "Unofficially, we handle situations that don't fit standard protocols. Temporal incursions, spatial anomalies, things that challenge our understanding of reality." She pulled out a tablet, showing me a map covered in red dots. "This isn't the first temporal crossing zone we've encountered, but it's by far the most active, and it's accelerating." The map showed dozens of incidents worldwide, a village in Romania where people from the 14th century occasionally appeared, a stretch of ocean near Bermuda where ships from different eras reportedly encountered each other, a valley in Afghanistan where Soviet soldiers from 1979 were still fighting a war that ended decades ago. "These passages," I said, "they're everywhere?" 47 confirmed sites globally, but the Rio Grande crossings are unique. They're not random. They specifically manifest during times of mass displacement and suffering. Every major conflict, every humanitarian crisis along this border creates temporal refugees. Professor Patterson, who'd been sedated but was now awake and lucid, joined our discussion. "It makes sense from a quantum mechanics perspective. Extreme human suffering might create enough psychic energy to tear holes in space-time. The border, being a site of continuous historical trauma, would be particularly vulnerable." "Psychic energy?" Jake asked, skeptically. "Consciousness affects reality at the quantum level," Patterson explained. "It's been proven experimentally. Now imagine thousands of desperate people, all focused on the singular desire to escape, to cross over to safety. That collective will might be enough to literally tear through the fabric of time." Maria entered the room with fresh intel. "We've got a bigger problem. The passages aren't just allowing people through anymore. Infrastructure is starting to cross over. A Spanish mission from 1687 just materialized near Presidio. A Confederate fort appeared outside Del Rio. And..." She paused. "Something's coming through from what looks like the future. Drones, but more advanced than anything we have." Agent Foster stood up. "We need to evacuate the civilian population from the affected areas." "That's about 10,000 people," Tom pointed out. "How do we explain it?" "Chemical spill," Foster said without hesitation. "Train derailment carrying hazardous materials. It's worked before." While they coordinated the evacuation, I stepped outside to clear my head. The morning sun was painting the desert in shades of gold and pink, but I could see distortions in the air. Ripples like heat mirages, but wrong somehow. Through them, I caught glimpses of other times. A Comanche war party racing across the desert. A group of Chinese railroad workers from the 1880s. Mexican revolutionaries from 1915. All existing simultaneously, overlapping, creating a palimpsest of history. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived from Alpine, having driven through the night. She looked exhausted but excited. "Roy, I've been researching all night. I found something in the Spanish colonial archives. This has happened before. In 1680, during the Pueblo Revolt, the Spanish documented massive temporal disturbances, people from different eras appearing and disappearing. They called it La Convergencia, the convergence." "What happened?" "According to the records, it lasted for 7 days. Then something they called El Guardián del Tiempo, the Guardian of Time, appeared and sealed the passages, but at a cost. Hundreds of people were trapped outside their proper time, unable to return home. The Guardian of Time? What was it? The descriptions vary. Some say it was an angel, others a demon. A few claim it was a man who had lived so many lives across so many times that he existed outside normal temporality. She pulled out a reproduction of an old painting. It showed a figure surrounded by swirling clouds of time, reaching out to close tears in reality. The figure's face was obscured, but something about its posture seemed familiar. Shafter, I breathed. The cavalry colonel who had charged back into the canyon to fight the temporal predator. As if summoned by his name, a rider appeared on the horizon. Even from a distance, I recognized the military bearing, the cavalry uniform. But as he got closer, I could see he had changed. His edges seemed to blur, as if he existed in multiple states simultaneously. His eyes held depths that spoke of centuries, not decades. "Sheriff," he said, dismounting. His horse, I noticed, was also wrong. Sometimes it was a cavalry mount from 1875, sometimes a Spanish conquistador's horse, sometimes something that might have been from a future I couldn't imagine. "Colonel Shafter, we thought you were dead." "Death is a concept that applies to linear beings," he replied. "I've become something else. The entity you fled from. It didn't destroy me. It transformed me. I now exist across all time simultaneously. I can see the full scope of what's happening here. Can you stop it? Not stop. Redirect. Channel. The convergence is inevitable. Too much temporal pressure has built up along this border. But we can control where it releases." He pulled out a map, but it wasn't like any map I'd seen. It showed the border across time, all eras superimposed. There are 7 primary passages. If we can seal 6 of them, force all the temporal energy through a single point, we can minimize the damage. How do we seal them? With anchors, people who are willing to stand at each passage and hold it closed through force of will. But it's a one-way trip. Anyone who serves as an anchor becomes permanently unstuck from time. They'll exist in all moments simultaneously, forever guarding that point. The weight of what he was asking settled on the room. We needed 6 volunteers to essentially sacrifice their linear existence to save thousands of others. "I'll do it," Maria said immediately. "I've already been exposed to the temporal field multiple times. I'm partially unstuck anyway." "I'm in," Jake added. "Can't let you have all the glory, Santos." Professor Patterson raised his hand. "This is the discovery of a lifetime, even if that lifetime becomes non-linear." One by one, others volunteered. Tom Rodriguez, Amy Chen, the park ranger, even Dr. Vasquez, though I tried to talk her out of it. "Roy, I've spent my entire life studying the border's history," she said. "Now I have a chance to become part of it, to exist in all the times I've only read about. How can I refuse?" That gave us 6 volunteers. Shafter would handle the 7th passage, the one that would remain open to channel the temporal energy. "When do we do this?" I asked. "Tonight," Shafter replied, "when the convergence reaches its peak. But understand, even if we succeed, things will never be quite the same. The border will always be thin here. People sensitive to temporal fields will sometimes see through to other times, and occasionally refugees from other eras will still slip through." We spent the day preparing. Agent Foster coordinated with her mysterious superiors, arranging for the area to be cleared of civilians. The volunteers were briefed on what to expect, though how do you really prepare someone for existing in all times simultaneously? As the sun set, we positioned ourselves at the 7 passages. I stayed with Shafter at the primary passage in Boquillas Canyon, where this had all started. The others were spread along 50 miles of border, each at a point where time had worn thin. At exactly 9:00 p.m., the convergence began in earnest. The sky tore open like fabric, revealing the swirling chaos of temporal energy beneath. Through the tears, I could see thousands of years of history playing out simultaneously. Conquistadors marched alongside modern migrants. Apache warriors rode past border patrol vehicles. Revolution-era soldiers fought battles that ended a century ago. "Now!" Shafter commanded through our radios. At 6 points along the border, our volunteers stepped into the passages. I watched through binoculars as Maria took her position, her form immediately beginning to blur and shift. She was Maria Santos, Border Patrol agent of 2021, but also Maria Hernandez, revolutionary of 1915, and Mary Whitefeather, Apache scout of 1886, and countless other iterations across time. The passages began to close, the temporal energy being funneled toward our position. The pressure was immense. Reality itself groaned under the strain. The canyon walls began to crack, not from physical force, but from the weight of overlapping timelines. Through the primary passage, refugees poured through, not just from the past, but from futures we could barely comprehend. People fleeing wars that hadn't happened yet, disasters that might never occur, seeking safety in times that weren't their own. "We can't let them all through," Foster shouted over the chaos. "The present can't handle this many temporal refugees." "We don't have a choice," Shafter replied. "They're here. They exist. Sending them back would create paradoxes that could unravel causality itself." For hours we watched as history emptied itself into our present. Soldiers, civilians, farmers, merchants, priests, warriors, all displaced by the countless conflicts that had scarred this border. Some looked around in wonder at our modern world. Others seemed unsurprised, as if they'd always known they would end up here. Among them, I saw familiar faces, the Confederate soldiers we'd encountered, looking for a war that had ended long ago. The Mexican military convoy Maria had first spotted. Even indigenous peoples from before European contact, displaced by temporal storms we were only beginning to understand. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The passages sealed, the sky mended itself, and the desert fell silent except for the confused murmur of thousands of temporal refugees. "What do we do with them all?" Agent Foster asked, surveying the crowd. "We help them," I said. "We integrate them. We give them new identities, new lives. What else can we do?" Shafter, now more ghost than man, his form shifting between states, nodded approvingly. "The border has always been about crossing over, about finding new life on the other side. Now it's just a different kind of crossing." "What about you?" I asked him. "I remain here," he said. "The passages are sealed, but there'll always be weak points. Someone needs to watch them, to make sure they stay closed. That's my role now, eternal guardian of temporal stability along the Rio Grande." "And our volunteers?" "They exist in all times now, past, present, future. They experience it all simultaneously. They're the anchors that keep the passages closed. In a way, they've become immortal, existing in every moment of the border's history." As we organized the temporal refugees, getting them food, water, and temporary shelter, I found myself thinking about what this meant for the future. The border had always been complex, a place where cultures, languages, and nations met and mixed. Now it was also a place where times converged. Over the following weeks, the cover story held. The chemical spill explanation satisfied most people, and those who'd witnessed the temporal events were either convinced to stay quiet or dismissed as unreliable. The temporal refugees were gradually integrated into society with help from Foster's organization, given new identities and histories. But some things couldn't be hidden. The Spanish mission that had appeared near Presidio became a tourist attraction. The Confederate fort was turned into a historical site, with historians puzzled by its pristine condition. And occasionally, people reported seeing figures from other eras. A conquistador on horseback, Apache warriors in the mountains, revolutionary soldiers patrolling roads that no longer existed. I kept in touch with our anchors, or tried to. They could sometimes communicate through dreams or visions, existing as they did in all times simultaneously. Maria appeared to me one night, her form shifting between her many temporal selves. "Sheriff," she said, her voice echoing across centuries. "The border is quiet for now. But time isn't done with this place. There will be other convergences, other crises. The passages we sealed are scars now, and scars can reopen." "Will you be okay?" I asked. She smiled, an expression that existed in all her iterations simultaneously. "I'm everywhere and everywhen now. I see the full pattern of history along this border. It's beautiful and terrible and endless. I'm more than okay. I'm complete." 6 months after the convergence, Brewster County had become the strangest jurisdiction in Texas, maybe in America. On paper, our population had increased by about 3,000 souls. In reality, those souls came from across 3 centuries of human history, and integration was complicated. I was in my office reviewing what we diplomatically called temporal adjustment cases when Deputy Jake Martinez knocked and entered. Jake had changed since the convergence. Though he hadn't become an anchor like the others, his exposure to the temporal fields had left him sensitive to time's fluctuations. Sometimes he knew things before they happened. Sometimes he remembered things that hadn't happened yet. "Sheriff, we've got a situation at the Walmart in Alpine." "What kind of situation?" "The 1847 kind. Some of the Mexican War refugees are having trouble with the self-checkout machines. Again." I sighed. This was our new normal, helping people from 1847 understand barcode scanners, teaching Apache warriors from the 1880s how to use smartphones, explaining to Confederate soldiers why they couldn't bring their muskets into restaurants. "Also," Jake continued, "Agent Foster is here, says it's important." Diana Foster had become a regular visitor, her anomalous events division essentially setting up a permanent office in our county. She was waiting in the conference room with someone I didn't recognize, an elderly Hispanic man in an expensive suit. "Sheriff Brennan, this is Dr. Miguel Santana from the Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia in Mexico City. He's been researching temporal phenomena on the Mexican side of the border." Dr. Santana stood to shake my hand. His grip was firm, but I noticed his eyes had that same depth I'd seen in others who'd been exposed to temporal fields. "Sheriff, I'll be direct," he said in accented but perfect English. "The passages you sealed are holding, but the temporal pressure is building again. Not here, but further south. The Mexican government has been dealing with our own convergence events. Aztec warriors appearing in modern Mexico City. Revolutionary soldiers from 1910 still fighting battles in Chihuahua. The entire border is temporally unstable," Foster added. "Not just the Rio Grande, but the whole concept of borders in this region. The repeated trauma, displacement, and conflict has weakened the fabric of space-time." "What are you telling me?" "We need a permanent solution," Dr. Santana said. "The anchors your people became are holding for now, but their human consciousness is trying to hold back forces beyond human comprehension. Eventually, they'll break." "So what do you propose?" Dr. Santana pulled out a tablet showing me architectural plans. "We build a monument, not just stone and metal, but a temporal stabilizer. Using what we've learned from the passages, we can create a structure that exists in all times simultaneously, a permanent anchor that doesn't rely on human will." The plans were ambitious. 7 towers along the border, each one at a passage point, connected by a network of quantum-entangled particles that would create a temporal firewall. It was science fiction, except we were living in a world where Confederate soldiers shopped at Walmart and Apache warriors used GPS. "The cost," I began. "Is already approved," Foster interrupted. "Both governments, plus some international organizations that prefer to remain unnamed. Turns out, temporal stability is in everyone's interest." "What about our anchors, Maria and the others?" "If this works, they'll be freed," Dr. Santana said. "They can choose to return to linear existence or remain in their expanded state, but they won't be obligated to hold the passages anymore." While the governments worked on their monument, I dealt with the day-to-day reality of a temporally diverse population. We'd had to create special programs, temporal integration services, to help refugees from other eras adapt. The local community college offered classes in modern life skills, where a former Confederate cavalry officer taught horse care while learning to drive a car, and a programmer from 20s 89, who'd fled the water wars, taught advanced mathematics while learning that our primitive internet still required passwords. The most successful integration story was Isabel Morales, who'd crossed over with the 1847 convoy I'd first witnessed. In her time, she'd been the daughter of a wealthy Mexican landowner fleeing the American invasion. In our time, she'd become a translator and cultural liaison, helping other temporal refugees adapt. She had a gift for languages and had quickly mastered modern English, though she still occasionally slipped into the formal Spanish of her era. "Sheriff Brennan," she said, finding me at the diner one morning, "we have a problem with the Comanche delegation." We'd been calling them delegations, the various groups of temporal refugees who'd formed communities based on their origin times. The Comanche delegation consisted of about 40 warriors and their families who'd crossed during the convergence, originally from the 1870s. "What kind of problem?" "They want their land back. They say since they're from a time before the treaties that took it, those treaties don't apply to them." This was the kind of legal nightmare that kept lawyers up at night. What jurisdiction applied to someone from 1875? Did modern laws apply to temporal refugees? The Supreme Court was still refusing to hear cases about it, probably hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself. "Set up a meeting," I told Isabel. "We'll figure something out." The meeting was held at the community center, which had become our unofficial temporal refugee coordination point. The Comanche delegation was led by a war chief named White Eagle, who'd adapted to modern times with surprising ease. He wore traditional dress but carried a smartphone and had learned to use social media to advocate for his people. "Sheriff," he said in English he'd learned from YouTube videos, "we're not asking for all our land back. We understand the world has changed, but we want recognition, and we want a place where we can live according to our ways. The Bureau of Indian Affairs doesn't recognize us," White Eagle interrupted. "According to them, we don't exist. We're not enrolled members of any modern tribe because we predate the enrollment system. We're ghosts in your bureaucracy." He was right. The temporal refugees existed in a legal limbo. They were clearly here, clearly real, but had no official status, no birth certificates, no social security numbers, no legal existence in the 21st century. "I'll talk to Foster," I promised. "Maybe her division can help." As I left the meeting, I noticed something odd. The air was shimmering again, that familiar distortion that preceded temporal events. But the passages were sealed. This shouldn't be happening. I drove out to Boquillas Canyon, to the spot where the primary passage had been. The construction crew for the temporal monument was already at work, laying the foundation for one of the 7 towers. But they'd stopped working, all of them staring at something. Lieutenant Colonel Shafter was there, more solid than he'd been in months. His form had stabilized, no longer shifting between states. He looked almost human again, except for his eyes, which reflected centuries of experience. "Sheriff," he said, "we have a visitor." Standing beside him was a figure I recognized from Dr. Vasquez's old painting. El Guardián del Tiempo, the guardian of time from the 1680 Convergence. But seeing it in person, I realized it wasn't an it at all. It was a man, or had been once. He was dressed in clothing that seemed to be from every era simultaneously. Spanish colonial, Native American, Mexican Revolutionary, modern American, and styles I couldn't identify that might have been from futures yet to come. "Sheriff Brennan," the Guardian said, his voice carrying harmonics from multiple timelines. "I am Tomas de Herrera, though I've had many names across many times. I was once a Spanish soldier, then a temporal refugee like your friends, and finally, something else entirely. You're the one who sealed the passages in 1680. I am. And I've come to warn you. Your monument, while well-intentioned, will not work. You cannot use technology to permanently seal tears in time. The passages are not flaws to be fixed. They're pressure valves. Block them completely, and the pressure will build until it explodes catastrophically. Then what do you suggest? Management, not closure. The passages must remain partially open, allowing controlled crossings. Your anchors understood this instinctively. They don't block the passages. They regulate them." "But they're suffering," I protested. "Existing in all time simultaneously is destroying their humanity." "Is it?" Tomas asked. "Or is it expanding it? Ask them yourself." The air shimmered and Maria appeared. Not just an echo or vision, but actually present, pulled into linear time by the Guardian's power. She looked different, ageless, wise, with eyes that held infinite depth. "Sheriff," she said, smiling, "I know you're worried about us, but we're okay. More than okay. We see everything now, past, present, and potential futures. We understand the full scope of human migration, suffering, and hope along this border. But you're trapped. We're free," she corrected, "free from the prison of sequential time. We exist in all moments, can influence events across history. Jake's great-grandmother was saved from a massacre in 1915 because I was there to warn her. Tom's descendants in 2150 will survive the climate migrations because he's there to guide them. The anchors have become something new," Tomas explained. "Not human, not divine, but something in between. Guardians of the border's temporal integrity. In time, others will join them, creating a network of consciousness that spans all of human history." "And what about the refugees already here?" "They're part of the pattern now," Maria said. "Their presence in this time will change history, has already changed it. Some of their descendants will become presidents, scientists, artists. Others will simply live quiet lives, adding their threads to the tapestry of time." Agent Foster had arrived during this conversation, along with Dr. Santana. They listened without interrupting, though I could see Foster recording everything on some device I didn't recognize. "So we abandon the monument project?" Dr. Santana asked. "Modify it," Tomas suggested. "Instead of towers to block the passages, build structures to channel and regulate them. Create customs houses for temporal immigration. Some refugees from failing timelines need sanctuary. Why not provide it officially?" It was a radical idea, official temporal immigration policy. But then again, we were already living in a world where it was happening unofficially. "The governments will never agree to that," Foster said. "They will," Maria said with certainty that came from seeing multiple futures. "In 17 months, there will be another convergence event, this time in Washington, D.C., when senators find themselves face-to-face with refugees from America's future collapse. They'll understand the necessity." "America's future collapse?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know. "One possible future," Maria clarified. "Time isn't fixed, Sheriff. Every choice creates branches, possibilities. The refugees we help today might prevent the disasters their descendants would otherwise face. Over the following weeks, the plan changed. The monument became something different. Not a wall against time, but a gateway to regulate it. The anchors remained in place voluntarily, now seen as honored guardians rather than victims. The temporal refugees were given a path to legal status, though the paperwork was unlike anything the immigration system had ever dealt with. I found myself at the center of it all, the sheriff of a county that existed in multiple times simultaneously. My morning might include mediating a dispute between 1847 Mexican refugees and 2089 American refugees about water rights, then investigating a theft where the suspect literally didn't exist yet, followed by helping a Comanche warrior from 1875 apply for a driver's license. Jake had become my specialist for temporal crimes. His sensitivity to time made him invaluable for investigating cases that crossed chronological boundaries. Just last week, he'd solved a murder where the killer had fled to 1923, requiring coordination with the anchors to track him down and bring him back for trial. The world was slowly adapting to the new reality. Universities created temporal studies departments. The UN established a Committee for Temporal Refugee Affairs. Dating apps added a field for century of origin. But the biggest change was in how we understood the border itself. It was no longer just a line between nations, but a membrane between times, a place where history folded in on itself. The Rio Grande had become the Rio Tiempo, the river of time. One evening, a year after the convergence, I stood at the spot where I'd first witnessed the temporal crossing. The new regulatory station was under construction, a gleaming structure that would exist partially in multiple timelines, allowing controlled and documented temporal immigration. Shafter appeared beside me, as he often did these days. He'd become something like a guardian spirit of the border, existing in all times but choosing to manifest in ours. "Any regrets, Sheriff?" he asked. I thought about it. My job had become impossibly complex. I dealt with crimes and situations that no law enforcement training had ever covered. I'd seen things that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. "No," I said finally. "No regrets. This is what the border has always been. A place of crossing, of transformation. We're just being honest about it now." "The passages will never fully close," Shafter warned. "There will always be refugees from failed timelines, fleeing disasters that haven't happened yet, or seeking escape from tragedies that happened long ago." "Then we'll help them," I said. "That's what we do here. We help people cross borders, whether those borders are between nations or centuries." As the sun set over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, I could see them, the temporal refugees going about their lives. A conquistador learning to use an ATM, Apache children playing with kids from 2089, Mexican revolutionaries and American cavalry officers working together on the construction crew. It wasn't the world I'd expected when I became sheriff 34 years ago. But it was the world we had now, where the border wasn't just a line on a map, but a gateway through time itself. My name is Sheriff Roy Brennan, and I protect and serve a population that spans 3 centuries. Some of them haven't been born yet. Some died before my great-grandfather was born. But they're all my responsibility now, all residents of a county that exists in multiple times simultaneously. The border crossing that doesn't exist on any map is now the most important crossing in the world, because it doesn't just connect 2 countries. It connects all of human history, past, present, and future. And I'm the sheriff who has to keep the peace across all of it. Time isn't a line, it's a web, and here in Big Bend, we're the spiders keeping it from tangling. Welcome to the new normal. End recording. Sheriff Roy Brennan continues to serve Brewster County, Texas. The temporal regulatory stations along the Rio Grande are now operational. processing an average of 12 temporal refugees per month. The anchors remain at their posts, existing in all times simultaneously, guardians of temporal stability. The border crossing that doesn't exist officially doesn't exist, but if you know where to look, when to look, you might catch a glimpse of history walking through the desert, seeking what all refugees seek: a better life on the other side. Even if that other side is in a different century.